So someone obviously gave David the really long version of my bio sketch, and for that I apologize. Next time he'll get like 3 sentences. Thank you, David. It's an honor to be here today, and especially to be giving a talk in honor of Dr. Stombaugh. As I understand, Dr. Stombaugh's military service was, in fact, a life-changing experience for him. And it's interesting, I have not been in the military, but what I'm going to talk about today was in some ways analogous to a bit of military service. And I'm going to talk in part about the role of the medical profession in this enterprise, but also about the way the medical profession fits into the larger societal goals and aspirations. I spent a little time on the phone with Dr. Dukas before coming here to talk about sort of what type of thing he wanted me to talk about, because I tend in this talk towards the sort of political. And I just give you that as sort of a warning, that not everyone thinks that everything I say is ethics. But, you know, ethics is different things to different people. There's a stupid joke about this, but I'm going to tell it anyways, about the little old lady. Some of you have probably heard this. Little old lady who goes to her attorney to get the will filled out, and after filling out the will, the attorney says that's $100, and she carefully opens her pocketbook and takes out a crisp $100 bill and hands it to him. And just as she's leaving the room, he realizes that she's handed him 2 $100 bills stuck together. And immediately an ethical dilemma arises. Should he tell his partners? Okay, only like 3 of you got that joke. This is really sad. Where's the ethics education here, David? There is an old Chinese proverb. And this isn't so much funny, but it's interesting, and it's a nice setup for what I'm going to talk about. There's a Chinese proverb about a monkey who is caught in a deluge, a storm, a flood, and he's being swept along in the roiling waters. There are stones, there are sticks, and so on. And he's really at risk of his life. And in the context of this deluge, he meets a fish. And the fish and the monkey become fast friends almost immediately. And then the monkey, just as he's about to drown, sees a branch hanging over the water. He grabs the branch and swings himself up to safety. And then, because he likes the fish so much, he reaches down and rescues him too. And the moral of this story is that in a disaster, it's not enough to just want to help people. You have to understand what they need. And that's, in many ways, the broader lesson of the entire response to the tsunami 2 years ago. Yeah. Oh, I better take away the paper. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'll just do a brief review of the tsunami itself and sort of what the impact of the tsunami was on one area in Indonesia where I ended up on a volunteer mission last year. But then I'm going to talk quite a lot about the unique nature of this volunteer mission. It turns out that the military and civilian non-governmental organizations have never before cooperated in the way that we did in response to the tsunami, with a non-governmental organization, namely Project Hope, actually placing doctors and nurses on a Navy hospital ship and sending that ship to the tsunami-devastated area. And both the benefits and the risks of that kind of integration of the medical impetus and the military mission is largely what I'm going to talk about. So I retitled the talk a little bit around altruism and self-interest, lessons from America's first military civilian medical mission. So this tsunami, as you will recall, occurred on December 26th of 2004. It occurred about, the earthquake was, which probably registered around 9.2 on the Richter scale, occurred about 50 to 70 miles off the coast of the northern tip of Sumatra, which is one of the islands of Indonesia. And as you can see, the magnitude of the quake as depicted here was large enough that it was felt as far away as Sri Lanka, India, the Maldives, Thailand, and so on, but it was really very close to Indonesia, and the estimate is that from the time that the wave initially would have formed to the time that it hit the land was maybe 5 to 7 minutes. So really, had there been a warning system, it probably would not have made much difference to this particular area. This is the islands, these are the islands of Indonesia, and I just put it up to show you that this isn't the last time this is, that something really devastating on a geologic scale is going to happen. The triangles are active volcanoes. So this is a very geologically active area, and you can see where the fault lies, where the earthquake occurred. This is just a satellite photo of the general area around Banda Aceh, and I'll show you a closer picture in a second, but I put this up to show how dramatically the coastline was changed. Some of the issues that people were dealing with had to do with the fact that property no longer existed. It's now underwater. So property records and ownership and many vital records were destroyed. One of the kids that we actually ended up bringing back to Boston with us for treatment didn't have any records of who he was. His parents, all of their vital records had been destroyed and had to be recreated in order for him to be able to come to the States for medical treatment. This is the area of Banda Aceh, and I want you to pay attention to the fact that there are these islands on either side. So I don't have a pointer, but the earthquake takes place up here, and the wave comes like this through these islands, like a funnel, into Banda Aceh. And you all probably remember even better than I the Bernoulli effect. What happens when a wave comes into an area of constriction? The wave gets much larger, obviously. So this is actually a satellite photograph of Banda Aceh, just a little piece of it the day before the earthquake. And the thing to notice here is this is not an area of the world that is, sub-Saharan Africa, tiny little village thatched huts. This is a big city. And it was fairly well developed. It's, normal buildings, yards, people with, boats and docks and so on. And that's that same picture the next day. So the devastation is actually hard to picture or imagine, even seeing this. It was something that even our experience with Katrina doesn't quite do justice to the kind of havoc and change that occurred here. At the time we arrived, the estimates were that they had buried 130,000 people in Aceh province and that about 37,000 were still missing. There were 500,000 people displaced, and 50 of the 250 or so sub-district governments were still completely non-functional, and this was about 8 weeks after the tsunami that we finally arrived. Banda Aceh itself lost about 75% of its healthcare workers. Probably only 10% or so were actually killed, but many left, and I'll get back to that in a second. I mentioned already that government records were destroyed. The transportation obviously is severely affected. Water waste facilities, many wells were poisoned because there were bodies of people and animals in the wells. The livelihood of many people was destroyed because they were fishermen, and not only were they nervous about going back out on the water, but their boats were strewn inland, sometimes by kilometers inland. There were huge boats, several kilometers on the shore, and the rice paddies had been salinated. So a lot of problems. Let me read to you. While I was there, I sent home these emails, and I can't remember if I sent them to you, David, but I tried to sort of formulate in my head what was going on. So the first one I wrote was maybe a day after I had gotten there. We had trouble getting onto the computers. They did have internet access on this ship, but it was a satellite, and so sunspots. That's what the IT people said. You believe that? So sunspots apparently precluded us from being on the internet for a couple days. But here's what I wrote. It is hot and lush at the Banda Aceh airport. We came in on a C-130 military transport plane from Singapore. As we descended, we had to remain seated where there were no windows, so we couldn't see the devastation just a few miles away. And when we deplaned, the few local people hanging around at the little restaurant next door smiled at us. The airport grounds are clean, though not immaculate, and the area is flat for several miles around. The hills look far too distant to reach on foot in an emergency. But apart from the medical aid tents and helicopters coming in and out, it's hard to tell that there's been an emergency. It looks like any number of small airports in tropical lands. It's really only when we board helicopters for the flight out to the Mersey that we see the area destroyed by the tsunami. The leading edge of the tsunami is obvious. Debris piles have been formed and some construction equipment is visible below. Scattered buildings remain, the homes of those who built with stronger stuff. Many homes and other buildings were destroyed by the earthquake that preceded the wave. The earthquake itself was tremendously destructive, and many of the buildings are built of unreinforced concrete, so they collapsed. Multi-storied structures pancaked down, trapping the occupants inside. And most of the bodies of those trapped have not been recovered because the subsequent tsunami made unburying collapsed buildings either impossible or just less important than other work. After the leading edge, the destruction is almost complete. Very few buildings remain. The plants have all been killed by the salt water, though grass is starting to come back here and there. It is stunning in the most literal sense of that word, and I think it left us all breathless and sad and quiet. The pictures on CNN can't really convey the size of the area affected. But when we land on the ship, looking back towards the shore, at first it appears that there's a long white beach that runs as far as the eye can see, north and south along the island. The sea rises to meet a fat, sand-colored stripe, and above this, the lush green of the tropics. But it isn't sand. It is the band of dead plant life, rising 30 or so feet up the sides of the hills, and far deeper inland where there is no hill. Banda Aceh is a city without a hill. It lies in a valley leading into the sea, and the wave reached inland almost 3 miles here. The entire center of the city is destroyed. So the health system, along with the rest of the city, was obviously profoundly affected. I mentioned already that a number of the outlying clinics were destroyed. Banda Aceh, as I mentioned, is a pretty big city. It's one of the 4 cities in Indonesia where medical students can go for their clinical years. So there are multiple, about 25 or so medical schools around Indonesia, only 4 of which have clinical training as part of it. One is in Banda Aceh. This is the Zainal Abidin Hospital, and it's a referral hospital. There's a military hospital, but it's really much more accurate to call it a clinic. It's very small. And a few smaller private hospitals. I mentioned the number of public health centers. And most of the care, although the doctors are ostensibly paid by the government, they get about $150 a year by the government, or a month, I can't remember. In any event, it's a very small, $150 a month. It's a very small amount of money even for there. And so almost all of the care is essentially fee-for-service. So if you can't afford to see the doctor, you're not going to get in. And that means, of course, that there are a tremendous number of unmet medical needs at baseline throughout this region. This is the medical school, one of the medical school buildings, and you can see, I hope, although maybe only with the lights turned down, the level of silt. So the silt level was at about 1.5 meters throughout the entire university. There were maybe 200 or 300 patients at the Zainal Abidin Hospital on the day of the tsunami, none of whom survived. Only people who could move fast got out. And in fact, there was one entire group of lab techs who were having a birthday party in the main sort of courtyard area, and they all did not make it. So the lab tech situation was very grave. This is inside one of the buildings, and you can see there were a number of people who, when they saw the water coming and heard it and so on, got inside closets. And of course, they were just covered in silt in the closets and didn't survive. I was told that this was not just water. This was water that was thick and sulfuric smelling and black and warm. So it was not just, it wasn't, something you could easily swim out of. And I don't know if you've seen any of the videotape of the roiling water coming through downtown, but there are videos of this, and it's easy to see that if you got a full leg into there, you probably wouldn't be able to get out. They had worked for about 5 years raising funds and political support for buying a CT scanner at Aberdeen Hospital, and they received the CT scanner on December 13th. And they did about 10 scans on normal, healthy people to try and make sure they knew how to use it before the tsunami occurred. And of course, it looks nice and clean because this room has been cleaned, but the CT scanner itself was destroyed. This is the courtyard after some degree of cleanup had been going on, and so they just moved a lot of stuff out of the hospital. They estimated that 30 to 50% of their staff were dead, but another 20 or 30% had disappeared. They'd left the community, presumably for paid work elsewhere. The government mandated free care for anyone affected by the tsunami, but didn't pay for it. So it was a mandatory altruism on the part of the healthcare workers. And I have to say, there were ongoing earthquakes, right? There are aftershocks, some of which were 6 or 7 on the Richter scale, which is a pretty big earthquake. And so every time there would be an earthquake like that, an aftershock, a bunch of people would leave. Anyone who could would pick up and go, and then there'd be no care for several days until they'd start to trickle back. So the major focus of the aid groups at the time was to try and reestablish Aberdeen Hospital under its physician director, Dr. Roos, who, not coincidentally, had lost his entire family, 3 children and his wife, to the tsunami, and looked like he was about to cry every time you talked to him, just obviously devastated. So by the time this particular mission that I want to talk about arrived, there were a lot of doctors on the ground. They estimated maybe 5,000 doctors and many, many other health practitioners had arrived in Aceh province by the time we got there. And that's a major issue. It's a wonderful idea to bring this big floating hospital to Banda Aceh, but by the time the big floating hospital got there, an infrastructure is established and growing, and fitting this new facility into that was a major challenge. And this is a picture of the USNS Mercy next to the USS Abraham Lincoln, the aircraft carrier that also was there for a time. And it's just to give you a sense of the size of this vessel. It is a huge ship. It's like a cruise ship, but decked out as a hospital. These are the medical staff, and you can see the interesting mix of the Navy medical officers, the Project Hope medical personnel who are sort of ringing the Navy personnel, so the Navy personnel are in white or in beige. There were also a number of other types of volunteers on board. I'll get to it in a second. So the Mercy was mobilized from San Diego in 5 days, beginning at 10:45 on New Year's Eve. Apparently the President has to decide to deploy the Mercy or its sister ship, the Comfort. And the decision was made on New Year's Eve to send the Mercy. Here, they picked up supplies in Pearl Harbor, And it was sailed by the Merchant Marine, which I don't know how many of you have experience with the Merchant Marine, maybe none. But the Merchant Marine are a non-uniformed service, and they're kind of proud of their non-uniformed nature. So these guys look like pirates. They have long hair, ponytails, cut-off shorts, beards, as if in pointed contrast to the poor naval personnel who are all buttoned up and short hair and so on. So we have the Merchant Marine, we have the Public Health Service, we have the Naval Medical Personnel, and we have the Project Hope personnel. We had 2 shifts of 100 volunteers each. And then there was actually a 3rd shift that went out when the vessel was turned around to go back to Nias after the large earthquake there. Nias is an island further down Sumatra. So it was a unique and really impressive, frankly, military operation, which we got sort of plugged into as the NGO volunteers. This is the Mercy, and it used to be an oil tanker. Both of these, the Mercy and its sister ship, the Comfort, were oil tankers. And you can still tell that they're oil tankers when you're inside them because they're these big metal, walls that you have to kind of find the door to get through to the next section of the ship. So it's very well organized, where people land at the helipad on top, they go down to a triage area, casualty receiving area, then they go to radiology, then they go to CT scan, then they go to the OR, then the recovery room, and intensive care surgical ward, recovery wards. So it all is, a train like this, and it's really very well designed for mass casualty events of, to be honest, young, healthy people who have, bullet wounds. Of course, we weren't seeing young, healthy people with bullet wounds. We were, by this time, not even really seeing, by the time the Mercy arrived, it was 6 weeks after the tsunami, 5 weeks after the tsunami. So we weren't actually seeing many people who were directly affected by trauma of the tsunami itself. We were seeing all that pent-up demand for basic medical services that was not generally being met. And we were seeing some of the people who would have normally been taken care of at Aberdeen Hospital, but they didn't have the facility anymore. So as it was being rebuilt, this served as the tertiary referral center. There were, however, orthopedics facilities on shore. There was an ICRC hospital, there was a German medical facility, Australian medical hospital, and so on. We had to get on and off the Mercy by helicopter. Now, I don't know about you, but this struck me as odd because we were there with the Navy. And you would think maybe the Navy would be able to bring ships back and forth to shore and that you could fit, like 50 or 100 people on each ship. Well, unfortunately, that was, for a variety of reasons, apparently not possible, some political and some logistical. And so everyone who came on and off the Mercy had to go by helicopter. The helicopters could only fly certain hours of the day. They didn't want helicopters flying in and out at night. The Indonesians are very wary of Americans. 83% of Indonesians in the most recent poll say they worry that the Americans might invade them someday. So it is not an easy thing for the American military to come and interact with the Indonesian populace. And in fact, the Indonesians have been under an embargo, not an embargo, but a trade embargo, basically, with the U.S., especially with regard to military stuff, since the mid-90s because of trouble in East Timor and human rights violations. They're not anymore, by the way. One of the results of our interactions with the tsunami, for better or worse, has been a tremendous easing of the relationship between the Indonesian military and the American military. And you can hear both sides of that debate probably just in your own head. You can imagine the arguments for and against closer ties between the U.S. military and the Indonesian military. The ship has this incredible capacity with a 16-cycle CT scanner. You can scan someone in, about a minute. You can do a full body scan. Tremendous interventional radiology, surgical capacity, tremendous transportation. Food and water was no problem. Communications, equipment. We had air conditioning. In fact, now that I'm mentioning all this, I felt a little guilty. And so did everyone else on the ship, frankly. Because we went to Indonesia thinking we were going to be right in the thick of it, and we weren't. We were on this oasis offshore where we had air conditioning and 3 squares, and we would have visitors come who were on shore, who were doctors and nurses and so on, working with ICRC and the other relief organizations. And of course, they're very jealous. And in turn, I think we were a little bit jealous too that we weren't getting the experience of being on shore. Well, why weren't we getting the experience of being on shore? We arrive and we essentially have to watch and wait for a few patients to trickle over. Well, the reason we couldn't be on shore is because we were part of the U.S. military operation. And they didn't want military personnel on shore overnight. The Indonesians didn't want military personnel on shore overnight. And the military didn't want personnel on shore overnight, even not the NGO volunteer doctors. We were not allowed to spend the night on shore. Some of that, I'm sure, had to do with fears, force protection issues, as they say. Some of that had to do with the fact that they were frankly scared that someone would do something stupid and embarrass the U.S. And we are not just any old NGO anymore. Right? The people involved in this operation are now much more formally representatives of the United States. And the military worries a great deal about the repercussions of some soldier doing something stupid on shore. Well, they likewise worried about the repercussions of a Project Hope volunteer doing something stupid on shore. This is the lab, and I just show you a couple pictures here, sort of what the place looked like. This is a fuzzy picture, and that's, I swear, not really my fault. The ship is moving all the time. So it's hard to get really clear pictures from on the ship. And in fact, it was quite common in the post-op setting. You had to add something to your differential diagnosis for post-op nausea. Right, because there are some people who came on board and were nauseated because of a drug. Other people who were nauseated post-op because of, an infection, or because they don't like the food, or they don't like the water. We had quite a few complaints that the water didn't taste right because it's all this filtered water. But also people got seasick. This is just one of the many CT scans we did, and I'm not spending a lot of time on clinical issues here, but this was a huge sinusitis that had become an infected sinus and a mucocele. It was just gargantuan, and you can see her left eye was really proptotic because of this infected sinus, which we were able to drain. Very high-tech care was delivered here. This is one of the little kids in the intensive care unit, and you can see this looks a whole lot like a U.S. tertiary care facility, and in fact it was. And it's because we had all of this support. I put up my breakfast to show you how well we had as the doctors and nurses on board. And again, I think that's a benefit. We were well rested and ready to go every day. On the other hand, it made us think that maybe one of the things that this ship should be doing is providing rest and relaxation for some of the relief workers on shore, who maybe could spend a couple days on the Mercy and recharge their batteries. And in fact, we made that recommendation, and when the Comfort, the Mercy's sister ship, went to help out after Katrina. Comfort is based in Baltimore, so they sent the Comfort down to Katrina, and that's how they used it, was as an R&R facility for relief workers who could come out to the Comfort for a couple days. These are the wards. And I put this one patient up here because we know him well, and it's okay to show his picture. This is Fadil. He is the little boy who came to Boston to have a liver tumor removed. He survived and is doing great. But I wanted you to notice the bunks. So the second row of bunks there is about at this level. So in theory, and on the website for the Navy, you'll see it says this is a 1,000-bed hospital ship. Well, it is 1,000 beds, but you'd really have to be pretty well off in order to get into that upper bunk, let alone be able to like get in and out of it and go to the bathroom. So that upper bunk is essentially designed for people who are recuperating, resting, and so on, but are really doing pretty well. We didn't use any of the upper bunks. In fact, and here we get to another issue. Although this was a 1,000-bed hospital ship, and that's how it was advertised, and unfortunately that's how it was advertised to the relief agencies before it arrived in Banda Aceh, it was configured for this mission to use 250 beds. And beyond that, once we got there, they called it full at about 40. So we never had more than 50 patients on this ship at any time in the about 8 weeks it was there. It was last deployed in Desert Storm, and as many of you know, the Navy is not flush with medical personnel right now. Many of the medical personnel in the military are deployed, just like many of the military are deployed. So when they needed a big batch of doctors and nurses, this was sort of the opportunity to create this collaboration and fill the thinned ranks, essentially, of who would have normally staffed this ship. But the ship, in addition to not seeing service very often, the last 3 times, by the way, the ship was supposed to have been on a training mission. It was canceled because the people necessary to do the training mission were deployed. So it's supposed to have a training exercise every year, but they had been delayed, and then this came along. So there are multiple reasons why deploying this was a good training exercise for the U.S. But as I mentioned, it's not seen a whole lot of action, and it's not configured for humanitarian relief. There were, for example, no pediatric supplies at the time they left San Diego. So they had to collect pediatric supplies along the way at Pearl Harbor, and then many things were sent over to Singapore and then ferried over in helicopters. So what did we do while we were there? Well, if you look on the website, you'll see that we treated over 19,500 Achenese patients. That is a lot. Well, it's actually not quite entirely straightforward, however. We had a lot of patients who came to the ship, got a CT scan, and went back shore. That's a valuable service, but that person counts as one of these 19,500 patients. We also pulled a lot of teeth. And if you had 4 teeth pulled, that counted as 4 procedures in that 19,500. So I'll give you oh, by the way, we did a lot of other stuff beyond medical care, which was really, really helpful, maybe even more so than the medical care we provided. We fixed, and I'm using the royal we, because of course I had nothing to do with this, but we fixed up their ultrasound machines, we fixed up their laboratory equipment so that they could actually use some of these things again. That's very helpful. There's a huge machine shop on this ship that they can repair anything. It's incredible. It's, you know, many, many rooms of a machine shop. So they were able to bring stuff from on shore, fix it, and send it back, and that was extremely helpful. We conducted these trainings, CPR trainings, conducted some psychological stress-related trainings for the local population to help their own population address this trauma. So the ship itself actually saw 170 inpatient admissions over the course of the 7 weeks or so we were there. And a similar number of escorts, because the last thing you want to do is bring a patient on board with no family. You know, flying them out 20 miles offshore to sit on a ship where no one speaks their language except the other patients and so on. So every patient who came out had at least one escort with them. So individual patients, is about 9,500 that we treated, although that does include a lot of eyeglasses that we handed out and a lot of dental work. 19,512 distinct medical procedures and 285 distinct OR cases. The environmental preventive medicine unit saw a lot of action, and the public health service, as I mentioned, did work. But 170 patients, and we had 30 or 40 doctors on board at any one time. That I'm an ID specialist. When I do consults, I could have seen every one of those people, but I wasn't consulted on all of them, so I would get, one consult every other or every third day. So I was following, 4 or 5 patients. Well, that's not a lot, You can track that number of people pretty easily. So many of us, not everyone, by the way, many of us, though, felt tremendously underutilized. And that was sad because we hoped to be able to go back and forth to shore, to do work on shore and so on. And in point of fact, I only ended up going on shore twice in the 3 weeks that I was on the ship. I ended up on shore twice. So we did other stuff, and it was a lot of fun, and I met a lot of really wonderful people on this mission, both military and NGO personnel. We did, cardio kickboxing lessons on the flight deck in the evenings, and we did medical lectures. This is Mark Pasternak from Mass General, an ID colleague. We did lectures for each other in the evenings. We had various competitions just to sort of pass the time. And again, this is part of the potential trade-off, I suppose. The military is very worried about us. They didn't want us, overburdened. They didn't want us taking care of too many people, and God forbid, have someone die on the ship, and then we have to, so it's hard to run a tertiary care facility and have no one die. It means that the triage criteria have to be pretty unique. And as it turns out, the triage criteria were pretty unique, and they were never actually told to us. So it was hard for us on the ship. We became very frustrated not knowing who was making the triage decisions exactly and using what types of criteria. So this started out on the part of the volunteer staff as this very altruistic, we want to provide care to these people. And it turned into a sort of frustrating experience, albeit gratifying in its own way, but frustrating because we could see so many ways in which it could have been done better and improved. And it turns out that really one of the primary objectives of this mission from the military standpoint was to improve the American image in Indonesia, which, by the way, is not a bad objective. But it's not a strictly medical, humanitarian objective. And so the mixing of this public relations political objective and the humanitarian objective ended up causing a good deal of tension. By the way, it worked, at least to a certain extent. The overall image that Indonesians have of Americans is still fairly poor. Down a lot from 7 or 8 years ago when we enjoyed 60 to 70% approval ratings in Indonesia. It went down as low as 15% a couple years ago, right after the invasion of Iraq. But it bumped up to around 38% after our relief efforts. And 79% of Indonesians have said in a Pew poll that they believe our relief efforts have improved their view of Americans. So that was clearly another goal of the mission. It wasn't clear to us at the time we went that that was a goal of the mission, and in some ways I think it would have been better had that been stated up front, that you're going over not as a humanitarian, not as a strictly humanitarian person, you're going, or like as part of the Red Cross, you're going over as a representative of the United States. And we want you to reflect well on us because one of our goals is to help the Indonesians see what's in our hearts. And I think people would have signed up for that. I don't think they would have had any trouble finding volunteers to do that. But the fact that that was not an explicit part of the mission at the time we signed up ended up causing tension. Another goal of this, which we did know a little bit about before we signed on, was to test this new model of disaster relief with the overstretched military and the desire of doctors to do good in the world, was to, how can we bring in partnership the military and the NGOs, use resources together, and get better disaster relief where it needs to go. But a third or fourth goal, which was not ever made explicit, but has been made explicit subsequently, was to test the American capacity for force projection on the sea. This had not even crossed my mind, frankly, but part of what they were trying to learn in the military by doing this was, can we go someplace, even if uninvited, and establish a huge presence on the ocean right offshore to somewhere? This was an opportunity to do that. And so Rear Admiral Christopher Ames, who was in charge of a good deal of this operation, said, we've talked about this idea of sea basing for several years, being able to project power anywhere in the world without asking permission. What we're doing here validates the beauty of it. That is an explicitly military objective with essentially no humanitarian component. And again, we didn't know that we were part of this sea basing test. Again, I think you could have gotten volunteers who would have been happy to sign on to all of these goals. But none of them were made explicit, and I think that caused problems in the end. Now, I want to talk just for a few minutes to wrap up about some of the ethical risks and benefits of humanitarian relief operations. And I put this slide up just to say I'm not going to really touch on any of these. These are well-known risks of humanitarian relief operations. They're not in particular ethical dilemmas. They are problems that arise whenever you do humanitarian relief, and you need to recognize them and address them in advance. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. The generally recognized ethical issues have to do with cross-cultural issues, barriers to effective communication. And to be honest, I think the biggest cross-cultural issue we had ended up being on the ship, between the culture of the military and the culture of the NGO and these different cultures not having worked together before and trying this for the first time was a really unique and interesting set of dilemmas, and learning to trust each other and to sort of come clean with, okay, what is the deal here? What are we really trying to accomplish? What are we really trying to show? There's also this issue that is fairly well recognized, that it's hard to get adequate informed consent in any kind of a disaster setting, period. And when you add on top of that the issues of cross-cultural communication barriers, that becomes even more so. I'll give you one example also of this next dilemma of demonstrating an American standard of care, which is in fact not an American standard of care, and that is medical record keeping. We did a fair to middling job of record keeping, but I'll tell you, it is nothing like what you'd see here. I guarantee it. It's nothing like what we have to do at University of Chicago because of the legal issues and so on. So if some Indonesian doctor, and they did, come to visit us on the ship and saw sort of what we were doing, they'd be very impressed with a lot of stuff, but they also might walk away with the wrong impression about some of our standards of care, which we did make compromises on because of where we were and what we were doing and so on. Disaster triage is a very interesting set of issues because it's not the same as military triage, where the fundamental goal is to get people back in serviceable operation as fast as possible, and where you might actually take the most wounded and not treat them, because the resources are better spent on someone who's going to be more likely to pull through. But it's also not the U.S. emergency department standard of triage, which is we tend to pour our resources into those who have the greatest need, almost regardless of their likelihood of benefiting from some of those resources. And that has de facto been the standard of triage in the United States. We spend a lot of resources on very few people who have tremendous medical need. Those are obviously two very distinct sets of triage criteria. And what we had here was yet a third set of triage criteria, and it had to do with who can we bring on board the ship who's likely to have a successful outcome, who would not have a successful outcome if they stayed on shore. So it will be a save, but not so risky that they're going to come on the ship and die. So we had a large number of people with surgical illnesses where you could guarantee almost that it was going to be a good surgical outcome. People with anal atresia. We had a string of like 5 or 6 kids with anal atresia. Now, this obviously has nothing to do with the tsunami, but it was a good way to use the resources if your goal is to help people without taking too much risk. And finally, the use of images, which came up afterwards, because of course most of these people don't give us permission to use their images at the time we're seeing them. But then, beyond those general ethical issues in disaster settings, there are some very specific issues, and I just have a couple slides to finish up here on the benefits and risks to sort of summarize. Working together with the military, you can project massive resources. You get excellent relief, excellent support to the relief workers. You get this combined supply chain, which is really nice. So the military would not have had a line on eyeglasses and some of the drugs and other equipment that Project Hope is able to get through volunteer, donor sources. So Project Hope can funnel resources into the military, and then the military can help with logistics and getting it out. It's also nice working with the military because you do have very good force protection. You never really feel at risk when you've got snipers all around you, or maybe we should feel more at risk. I don't know, but there are tremendous resources that are brought to bear to ensure that the non-governmental people working with the military are very well protected. Both sides get training and experience working with each other on their different equipment and so on. And it is this opportunity for civilian volunteers to more formally be representatives of the United States overseas, and that is a valuable opportunity. I think I've mentioned all of this. There are, however, some risks, and I've alluded to these already, but a couple of them I haven't mentioned yet. One is cost effectiveness. It cost $6 million approximately to take this ship over there, just one way. It was $2.5 million in fuel to get the ship from San Diego to Indonesia. Now that's a lot of money. And it depends on what your goal is. If you think $2.5 million in fuel, the total cost of this operation is probably around $30 million to send this ship there and back. If your goal is to treat 170 patients in the OR, or even 9,000 patients in a hospital facility, you could probably do it cheaper than $20 or $30 million. On the other hand, if your goal is to have a big white ship that is a symbol of the United States helping out off the coast of Indonesia, and to get a lot of press coverage, and to make sure that people know that we really are there and we really are trying to help, then $30 million, frankly, to buy goodwill is cheap. When you consider what else we spend our money on, trying to influence foreign opinion of the United States, $30 million is nothing to get a big jump in the positive view of Indonesians towards the United States. Indonesia, as many of you know, is the world's most populous Muslim nation. To have a big jump in the perception of the United States in Indonesia is worth $30 million no matter how you spend it, if that's the goal. Now, if you're going to bring the military and the non-governmental organizations together to achieve this goal, there's still the question of sort of who should be in charge, how should the thing be operated, should it still run primarily on humanitarian ethical grounds, or should it run according to normal military rules of engagement? And the people who write about this for the military, there's a big 2-volume textbook on military medical ethics. They say that you should have the NGO, the Department of State, you should have the humanitarian arm be in charge with the military providing support. And there are a variety of reasons for that that I won't go into. But the NGOs are on board with that as well. They love to have support from the military. They do not want the military to run the operation. And in fact, in 1993, a group of the larger NGOs got together and put out these 7 principles, ethical principles that should govern humanitarian assistance. And those were humanity, impartiality, neutrality, independence, universality, voluntariness of service, and unity. And I just give you one quote. Each of these has a longer explanation, of course. Independence of action by humanitarian agencies should not be infringed upon or unduly influenced by political, military, or other interests. That is, in fact, explicitly breached by this operation, where the NGO operation was entirely ensconced within and governed by the military. And I think we saw some of the benefits of that, but we also experienced some of the problems in doing that. The problems that they look at and that they were most worried about at the time of this statement was if you have the military working too closely with you, if you become part of the military, then all the political objectives of the military are associated with you, and now when the GAM, which is the Indonesian, the Achinese liberation movement, now they see you as part of the U.S. military. That potentially makes the NGO worker a target. By the way, this is almost a unique situation around the world. When we walked in here, we didn't actually have a side in this independence movement, because we had sanctions against the Indonesian government for human rights abuses, but the GAM is a fundamentalist Islamic, movement that is, it was not uncommon to see little kids with Osama bin Laden T-shirts in this area. So we did not support the rebels, but we also didn't support the military to begin with. So we came in as almost a neutral party to this, and that's not going to be the case in many other parts of the world if NGOs want to try and work with the military. Lots of potential benefits, but some important questions having to do with risks to NGO volunteers. What is the mission? Is it an altruistic mission? Is it a political mission? Is it a military mission? Or some combination of those? What are the triage criteria? And I think these are the questions that need to be answered before NGO military cooperation moves forward along these lines. And it is moving forward along these lines, by the way. So, whether I think it's a great idea or not, this is moving forward. There will be more of these operations. There was already the one where Project Hope helped to staff the comfort for Katrina. Bill Frist has introduced legislation to create a civilian volunteer corps, which would presumably be able to assist in these kinds of missions. And I think before those types of missions are organized, they ought to answer these types of questions. I'll skip that and just go to one last thing. And this, I apologize in advance because this always actually chokes me up. But there was a wonderful woman, Tamalia, who was one of our interpreters. Tamalia is the curator for the Indonesian National Museum. Sort of the Smithsonian of Indonesia in Jakarta, and she speaks English very well. In fact, she has a charming British accent. So Tamalia served as an interpreter on the ship, and at the end, the last night actually, she was leaving, and she stood up and. Fortunately, someone had a recorder and recorded her, and this is what she said. I think it was Sir Arthur Chesterfield who said something along the lines that the human species is happiest when it is of service to others. Well, I do not think that I shall ever be on a happier ship than this one. I do not know if you're aware of it, but when I left Jakarta to join the Mercy, the front page article of one of the newspapers in Jakarta was about how Indonesian public opinion towards America was taking a major turn. This happened after Indonesians started reading about and watching via the television the thousands of Mercy missions flown by the helicopters of the Abraham Lincoln off the coast of Aceh. Daily, the helicopters dropped food, water, and medical supplies to the survivors of the tsunami, whom my government would never have been able to reach in time after the enormous destruction of roads and bridges and communications. And later, Indonesians witnessed the compassion of the doctors and nurses of the Mercy as they treated Achenese patients. I do not think any other government in the world would have been able to provide such an enormous quantity of aid so rapidly, because no other government is equipped with the enormous war machine that the United States has. And what happened is that in the last 3 months, we have watched that great war machine being used for something totally different, and in a way that was completely foreign to us. It was being used to heal and save thousands of lives, and quite frankly, at first we Indonesians watched with suspicion, and then in puzzlement, but finally with gratitude and fondness. During the last days before the departure of the ship, many of the patients were returned to shore to finish their final recuperation at Indonesian hospitals, many of which are just starting to fully function again. It was a very emotional time for me, as I've had to translate for many of the patients and doctors and nurses as they bid each other farewell. Over and over again, this is what the patients have been saying. I do not know how to thank you. I cannot repay you for what you've done. I have nothing with which to repay you. It is only God who will be able to repay you. It is one thing to heal people and to give them medical aid, but I think that there is another element in all this that you may not be aware of. These people that you've been treating are the poorest of the poor. They eat chicken or meat perhaps once a year. If they eat fish twice a week, that is already good. Normally their meal will be a plate of rice with some chili peppers and a bit of swamp spinach or other vegetable. There has been an insurgency going on here for many years. The military comes and extorts money out of them and burns their houses. Then the separatists come and kidnap them, extort money out of them, and burn their houses. They are frequently caught in the crossfire between the military and the separatists, and it doesn't matter because they are just garbage, people of no value. If they go to a hospital for help, they are not kept waiting for hours. They are sometimes kept waiting for days, and they are treated with arrogance and without care. Indifference is often the best they can expect. And then they came here. Here you not only healed their bodies, but you treated them with such gentleness, such compassion, and such great courtesy. For the first time in their lives, they were treated as human beings who have worth. You see a man who has lost an arm, a patient who has lost a leg, and yet when they leave the ship, they are all smiling. The joy in them is overwhelming. They are perhaps happier than they've ever been in their lives because for the first time they are aware of their worth as people, that their thoughts and feelings and lives count. When they leave here, they know that they are valuable. They leave with self-esteem. This is something very special and very rare that you have given them. In Indonesia, the words for thank you are terima kasih, which, if you translate them literally, means accept love. For what is it to give someone thanks other than to give them a part of your love? So allow me on behalf of my country and my people to express to you our gratitude and to give you our love. I'm going to stop there, and I'd be happy to take questions and comments. Tomatoes. That's Fadil, the most photogenic boy I have ever met, and I'm including my own children in that. Don't record that last part.
And in comparing how things went between what you experienced and what happened after Katrina, how would you say we improved?
So the question is, how did we improve lessons learned from responding to the tsunami in terms of responding to Katrina? And from a medical standpoint, of course, Katrina was a complete disaster. It was a total failure on every level. Despite heroic efforts by many individuals there, and particularly at Charity Hospital, as you know. So I don't know that we can say that these are analogous, though, because this occurred 6,000 miles away. So I'm not sure that anyone thought that the lessons we were learning were supposed to apply to the United States. I don't think many of us believed that things could fall apart so badly in the United States. It was so stunning, and I guess maybe the more apt analogy would be, were things learned after September 11th that were then either applied or not applied to Katrina, and I think that's a whole different talk. Now, that said, with regard to this specific issue, things were learned. So I mentioned that that the Comfort was sent to provide relief after Katrina. They didn't really even bother taking patients onto the Comfort. It was sent down there to provide rest and relaxation, a place of respite for the volunteer workers who were, trying their hardest but were getting burned out at Katrina. So that was a lesson. By the way, I should also say, on the way home, so the ship takes weeks to get home, a month. So it's about 2 weeks out, and it's stopping along the way, and it's in the Maldives, I believe, on their way towards Hawaii. So they're in Maldives doing some, clinics and so on. A very skeleton crew, but they kept some of the Project Hope volunteers to do these day-long clinics where they would go on shore and do vaccinations and so on. While they're in the Maldives, the Nias earthquake occurs, and I don't know, this was only big news for a couple days here, but the Nias earthquake was huge, and 1,000 people or so were killed. And so they turned the ship around and went back to Nias, which is an island a little further south along the coast of Sumatra. And by all accounts, I did not go back, but by all accounts it was a much better, smoother operation where the people did get on shore, they got to stay on shore, and that was a major point of contention, was we were not allowed to stay on shore.
So I want to thank you, Dr. Wynia. We have people who have to get back to class right now, and I want to thank you very much for this excellent presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you.